Well, good morning, Niels. Welcome to the University of Wollongong. It's lovely to have you here at the Australia National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security. That's ANCORS. And on behalf of the UOW Global Challenges Programme and Sustaining Coastal Marine Zones research theme within that. I head up that research theme of the UOW Global Challenges, and I'm also Director of Research at ANCORS. And as you know, I'm Professor Clive Schofield here at ANCORS. Professor Anderson, I realise that you're Director of Polar DTU, which is the Danish Technological University's Polar Research Centre, and I also understand that you're simultaneously heading up the DTU Space Centre. Your own background from our previous conversations is that you started off as a physicist and through your PhD studies became a geodesist, interested in positioning and accuracy measurements. Yep. And ultimately from those studies you were first employed really in a cartographic area associated with the production nationally for Denmark, or the Kingdom of Denmark, for topographic mapping, meaning land-oriented mapping. But I know my experience of you in more recent years has related to how you have, in a sense, stepped offshore into maritime issues related to maritime boundary issues, but also the delineation issues associated with the continental shelf, that is the seabed and subsoil deep underneath the ocean, particularly beyond the 200-mile limit of the exclusive economic zone, where broad areas may be placed under the sovereign rights of the coastal states, so long as they go through a complex process of presenting submissions to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. I wondered, as an initial start to our conversation, you could describe how it came to be that someone who was so terrestrially land-focused chose to dive in so deep offshore.
Thank you for the introduction, Clive. I appreciate very much to have this opportunity to visit you here at ANCORS. And I'm also very fond of having knowledge about that. Even here in Australia, you're interested in Arctic issues. So that's very nice, and I'm looking forward to perhaps give some inputs and informations about that. Regarding myself, I'm curious of nature, that's why I'm a academic nature also. So even though I'm a physicist and went into geodesy, life is always about opportunities, perhaps randomness in that, and to choose which one.
And the importance of luck.
And luck.
Opportunities
you have to be at the right place at a good time. So, and I'm actually, if something I find it interesting, then I want to go into more detail with that, and then it becomes more interesting. And that's, well, basically, the geodesy, or the surveying and geodesy part, is close to a lot of the things that you has also studied as a physicist or mathematical issues. So suddenly I saw that, for me at least, that you could do pure science, and really go into deep into some specific questions or issues. But what I liked was
more theoretical.
Yes,
issues.
Theoretical parts. But what I liked is to transfer those science into beneficial things for the society. That was important for me.
The practical implications. I was going to ask this later, though. That there is an issue here, though, many scientists talk about, of the frustration of their undertaking high-quality scientific research and translating that into practical impacts, and often in terms of policy impacts, the policy, changing government policy. You have been involved very much at the coalface of having multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary projects with many scientific disciplines feeding into producing outputs with demonstrable outputs in terms of government policy change. There are challenges associated with that. I wonder whether you could comment on how you overcome some of those challenges, not only of coordinating different scientific disciplines, but also translating that into change.
That's right. I mean, that's after my, again, it's a question about what's your interest and what's your feelings for what makes it fun to go at work. And I very early in my career I realized, also during my PhD studies, and so where I was so lucky to heading some projects, interdisciplinary projects actually. It was, of course, in relation to my PhD, but I have to combine a lot of interdisciplinary things there in order to achieve some results. So there I realized that working with people, being a manager, a project leader, so I found very interesting. So I'm at a very early stage choose to go a management way, and that's really, you have to be very precise on that in your mind, so to speak. And are you really going from a kind of a research career, a science career, where it's your own successes, or do you want to doing a management career,
a greater whole?
Yeah, where you make the others, your employees' successes, your successes, or your success. And I liked the last one, so I went into management. And very soon after my PhD, I got the opportunity to have a job, or was having the opportunity at least to go into to find out how could we transform the existing. Now we are back in the 90s, a very long time ago, but I'm a bit grown up, so to speak. So. Where at that time we had the challenge to transform the old analog way of producing topographical map into a purely digital production line.
Yes.
That means, of course, you produce paper maps from a digital information or a database, but also you have to produce maps for monitors and so. That was entirely new for us at that time. Which cartography should be used?
Yes.
It's not the same on a printed map, or shouldn't be, as on a screen. No, so that suddenly became a research area by us, and I found that very interesting. We have more PhDs on that actually. How can you adapt very fast information? That's what about, isn't it? A map. You should be able to adapt information very fast from a paper map or from a screen or a monitor.
And the translation to digital opportunities and formats gives you much more flexibility about what information you can show and what layering of information you can achieve.
But that's right. But then
unlike a static paper.
Yeah, but you couldn't fall in that hole to say, okay, now I have a lot more information available. Yes. Then I put everything out. Too much. Yes. So the big challenge was really to sort out of information and only pick the most necessary ones. Which really was the important points.
Which is a classic cartographic issue of, dependent on scale, what do you put in and what do you leave out, and for what purpose is the map?
Yeah.
What theme of the map, and therefore what information is more important for one map versus another, and what can practically, sensibly be shown on a given frame.
I often say that it's important to know where a hotel is, for example. It's important, but it's not the most important information. The most important information is the hotel. Is it open? Or has available rooms?
Yes.
Is there a restaurant? Yes. I mean, it's not the position of the hotel that's interesting. If it's fully booked or closed, that's information.
Yes, if it's under renovations, then it's irrelevant. But yes, it's a variety of information. Although the locational information is important to have, so that you can find it if it is open.
Yes. Well, I mean, I come back to your questions again. I mean, I went into management, and we actually succeed quite well in producing this new digital productions line, and it gave rise to a lot of research in that context, also on a global scale. It's very interesting. But again, back to the more basics. Producing maps is also about question about fundamental systems, coordinate systems.
Yes.
So there I was also, it was of course very interesting to me to try to, at that time, to transform the old geodetic systems into the new ones,
yes.
spaceborne systems.
Yeah.
But at that time came all the GNSS systems, that's global navigational satellite systems, GPS and all that.
Yep.
That suddenly made up the reference frames for all mapping or navigation or positioning on the Earth. So there was also a question of introducing those new reference systems in mapping,
yes.
in the new digital production lines, and in general, also for geodesy for high precision surveying. And okay, Denmark, or the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is
could you
yeah,
distinguish, because I know they mean slightly different things.
Denmark is a very small country. It's a smaller peninsula on the top of Germany, so to speak, in Europe, part of Scandinavia. But the Kingdom of Denmark is actually 3 countries. That is, of course, Denmark. Then it's the Faroe Islands, a small community also in the North Atlantic, 250,000 people.
Yes. So
and then
north of the Shetland Islands,
right.
and the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and then of course Greenland, 50,000 people on the
Enormous
biggest
space.
on the biggest island on the globe.
Occasionally Australia gets called the biggest island, but okay,
that's
I
a continent,
your...
isn't it? That's a continent, isn't it?
Very good.
It's not an island.
That's right.
So, and of course, when you go there, I mean, this is very big, and there you really feel that reference systems are important. To know where you are, precise reference systems also go to the high north. I mean, so it was really important. It's not that easy to introduce new reference system based on space systems, because you have to project those on markers, so to speak, on land, on the Earth.
Reference points, known positions on land.
So that was quite a challenge regarding Greenland, because it's a huge country and it's so remote. That was one of the big challenges.
There's an emerging theme here in your research that you've become ever more remote. Because if you're talking about the first Denmark and then Faroes and Greenland, the areas in the offshore that you're dealing with are inevitably remote from shore.
Yeah.
They are 200 nautical miles and more,
yeah.
And sometimes as much as 350 nautical miles or more from the coast, from the baselines along the coast. Was it through that need to transform the technologies and the reference systems what led you to transition from terrestrial into the offshore domain?
I think the background for me to going into this and going into trying to establish the Danish Continental Shelf project, actually, here we are talking about 10, 12, 14 years back, when we started on that, was of course that when we have this Kingdom of Denmark, I mean, we are actually also a polar nation. And to that, also not only regarding having a consistent reference system, but also you have obligations being actually a big country in area, perhaps
Absolutely.
not in population, but in area.
Yes.
So also the other countries around in the Arctic area, Canada, Norway, US, and so on, you must be aware that you are responsible of having consistent systems up there in Greenland. So, and that goes also for preparing for extended continental shelf claims and all that. That should be done in a fair way. And it's not only a question of saying, no, we don't want that, or we perhaps look upon that later. It has to be in good accordance with other nations for good cooperation and no problems will arise afterwards. So that was also, in a way, to fulfill the requirements to being a Arctic nation, that we went into this continental shelf project in order to claim what's really is the right to have for the Kingdom of Denmark.
Yes.
And
so partially it's obligation, but it's also, we are talking about the sovereign rights for the Kingdom of Denmark. So it's opportunity, and it's in a sense, it's what nation states do, is that they try to maximize their territorial area or the area of their jurisdiction in a maritime sense.
And it's especially important regarding the Kingdom of Denmark because it's 3 countries. Yes. And Greenland and such is not capable of doing that themselves. We have done this continental shelf project in very close cooperation with Greenland, but it's a matter for Denmark, for Copenhagen, to do that actually, because yes. we still have the foreign policy, we have the defense and all that still in Copenhagen. Otherwise, all the other things, more or less, is now governed by the home rules of the Faroes and the Greenland. Yeah. So it was also a question of being aware that we are a kingdom of Denmark. That means that we should tie us together as a federation, so to speak.
And there's a clear need, I would think, in terms of capacity, because if we have a population of 50,000 in the entirety of Greenland, pardon me, putting together a submission pardon me, for the CLCS, for the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, is inevitably a very complex process involving geodesy as from your own skill set, but geology and geomorphology and bathymetric
all the legal issues and everything,
and all the legal components to that submission also. It's why, for example, from an Australian perspective, it took 10 years to put together Australia's submission. It's a substantial undertaking.
It is.
And it's an inherently multidisciplinary undertaking to achieve that.
What was really encouraging and fantastic to experience was that we also had claims around the Faroe Islands. And the Faroe Islands is 250,000 inhabitants, but they are very, very, very good also from a point of a governmental level. So this was really a fantastic cooperation also with the Faroe Islands, because they not only had a lot of experts themselves and went into this and have done a fantastic job there, but also financed a lot of the necessary
information
observation, gathering, everything.
Surveying.
So that was fantastic to experience that. Greenland couldn't as such do it in the same way as the Faroes, but we have a fantastic cooperation with the Greenland government on this and governmental institutions on this. So, and again, I mean, it's also a question of, it makes things more complicated in approving things and everything when you have a kind of a federal nature. Being a kingdom.
Well, there are echoes of that in Australia.
I could imagine. And you see it in Canada as well. So, I mean, but you have to respect that. So it is. That has been fine. But again, I mean, coming back to my involvement with this is, of course, I found this very important. I found it interesting. Again, because of these interdisciplinary aspects. Not only combining geophysics and geology and all that, but again, moving around in this more dimensional space where it's made of science, it's made of governmental things, or legals and politics, and the solution. And the solution, the final solution, has to be found not in one of those dimensions, but in between them. That's what I find really interesting and challenging, and I like to work in that
space.
That space, and I've always done that because, I mean, national mapping, of course, for example, is also politics.
Yes. Absolutely.
It is fundamentally. So I mean, so you have to. I've been used to moving that.
Yeah.
To raise funds for that is very expensive. Why and all that? Because it's fundamental and things. So it always a kind of a compromise between science and politics and other things. So that was
very good.
Make it fun for me.
One aspect I should draw out here is that we are sitting in Australia, broadly talking about the Arctic, and as you alluded to earlier in our conversation, there is a fascination with the Arctic. Clearly, there is an issue here that the Arctic areas are fundamentally important to the Kingdom of Denmark, because Denmark is through the Greenland particularly is one of the Arctic 5 states, one of the 5 coastal states around the Arctic Ocean. But why is it, do you think, that many people around the world, a long, long way from the Arctic Ocean, including in Australia, find the Arctic so fascinating?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, I can tell why I found it fascinating. Not only being a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, I've been so fortunate to be there, and I think it's when most people I talk with, when they have been in the Arctic, well, they're lost. I mean, it's so fantastic.
Lost for words.
Yeah, the nature is so fantastic. It's so strange. It's extraordinary. It's wild. There you find a very, what's also fascinating is a very short distance between life and death, and you experience that every day if you behave
hostile, very confrontational.
Yeah, but it gives you also so much. So you go back to more the basic parts of your being, a human being, and you had to align up with nature because it's really fantastic up there. I mean, when you take the first breath up there, I mean, there's so much oxygen in the air, and you can. It's fantastic to feel that, it's spectacular in a way. The nature is spectacular, and that impresses most people.
You've emphasised there the fascinating nature of the Arctic, the fantastic, spectacular aspects of the pristine Arctic environment and the nature.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you've written that the Arctic is potentially a quote, high-class pantry, unquote, for resources into the future.
I imagine that. I see that, because that's again due to the global change. Because what we see now is that now the fish is going towards the north, and that means when you are fishing in the Arctic waters, that's a high-class fish.
Yes. Very
high quality. At the time being, it's mainly, generally marine resources are enormous, of course, we know, in the polar regions. But
we have a migration northwards.
There's a migration up north. Now herring and mackerel and so, and then come cuts. And now they see that the tuna is now appearing around Greenland. And that's really,
Yes, and that speaks opportunity to the fishing industry. That is simply opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, question then is this pristine environment, this wonderful nature, under threat?
It is, because I mean, you again fear that this will be about overfishing and short-term economic perspectives or
and competition.
And again, I mean, when it potentially is also an area for conflict, because one, there's there's a high class, high quality resources in a way. In this context, marine resources. Then you have illegal fishing and all that, and then suddenly you may have conflicts with your neighbors. You know all that old song there. So it's potentially also dangerous, because the criminal part follows the economy. So it's potentially also demanding a lot of making the infrastructure in place in order to make having a sustainable development of that area, because it's so vulnerable. That's one of the other things that's so fascinating about this nature in the Arctic. It's so vulnerable, actually. Yes. So if you don't behave, you can destroy it. You can destroy it for a very long time. And I mean, that's also fascinating, but it also means that...
also concerning.
It's concerning, yeah. So, I mean, seeing that the marine resources is changing in a way that the fish is going north. Even we perhaps are not prepared for that. That's a challenge.
So, Niels, you see the Arctic as potentially an arena for conflict.
Yeah.
And particularly you can see conflict where rival fishing fleets are trying to access the same shared stock and therefore potential friction between neighbouring Arctic states and with extra regional states, states from outside the Arctic, the fishing fleets associated with them. But also, are there sectoral conflicts, for example, between different activities that are increasing in the Arctic? Because the melting of Arctic sea ice cover in the northern summer allows potentially more navigational opportunities in terms of shipping going through the Arctic, potentially allows for more seabed energy resource exploration and development, notwithstanding the fact that the oil price has somewhat reduced in recent months. Still, there is a lot of speculation over the potential for that. How do you see how realistic and indeed desirable do you see those activities other than the marine living resources?
Well, you can say, actually we go from what I would call a kind of a stable situation to approaching a more unstable situation, actually, because a stable situation is actually when everything is frozen, so to speak.
Yes,
nothing is going around. I mean, and about talking about security, I mean the sovereignty and all that. You know, the tensions between states up north and so it is there because the U.S. and others and us, we want to look over to the Russians to see if they what they are doing, and so that's of course has been for a very long time a strategic point of interest for superpowers and also for us, of course. But it's a kind of stable situation because it's not possible to go around up there. It's very difficult, and so now due to climate change, that makes the area unstable. Due to climate change, due to the ice is opening, melting, the weather is probably going to be more unstable because of the opening in sea and so.
That's right.
But then again, opening for sailing routes and northern routes or whatever, again makes things unstable. So from a point of view of security and sovereignty and so, you go from a stable situation to an unstable situation because you have a lot more nations being present up there. You can't control it in the same way, and this instability is perhaps not to prefer regarding a overall security situation. At least that means that if this is going to be, I find it a very important point, and I try to promote that. If we are going to, or fancy that we should keep the stable, so to speak, in overall sense, situation in the Arctic, we have to develop an infrastructure up there so we can see what's going on up there. So,
what do you mean by that infrastructure? Do you mean remote sensing observation of the Arctic, so there's an awareness of activities that are occurring?
Yeah, I mean, if you have to be secure, safe in a way. You need to know what's going on. So, I mean, you need more information systems, situational or domain awareness, and it's not possible at the time being. I mean,
so this is where you are both director of the Polar Center and the DTU Space Center, and
exactly.
They combine into one interest.
You could say in a way that we need broadband on the North Pole, so to speak, to have a stable situation. Because then you can communicate, and you can communicate what you see. And I think it's regarding space infrastructure we have to develop that regarding the high north. Otherwise, it will keep unstable and perhaps be in future dangerous because then we don't know what's going on up there. So that's an important point.
And Niels, I will simply remark that we need broadband in Wollongong. as well as the North Pole.
Okay. Oh, it's not that bad at the hotel. It's okay.
But one thought here, though, is that how the extended continental shelf submissions and the process associated with them fits into that geopolitical arena for potential competition or friction, shall we say, if not outright conflict. Because in a sense, the whole process of putting submissions into the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, all of the Arctic littoral states appear to be, as it were, playing by the rules, preparing submissions that go into the CLCS. The Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf then makes its deliberations and assessment of those submissions, has a dialogue with the submitting coastal states, and then provides recommendations on which the coastal states define the outer or delineate the outer limit of their continental shelves. And all of the Arctic states, the exception here is the United States, which is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention through this process is set up, but Russia is preparing its resubmission. Denmark is proceeding with that process. Norway has put in its submissions already. Canada has put in a partial submission for the Atlantic and is preparing its Arctic partial submission. Everyone is playing by apparently the same rules in the same game. So the issue is, how do you see this as a point of conflict? In a way, this gathering of scientific information for the extended shelf is an opportunity for cooperation among the Arctic states.
Right. I mean, of course, it's potentially a conflict item or issue of extended continental shelf in the Arctic or in the Arctic Ocean. Let's say that.
Yes.
And that's why it's so important that the Arctic 5 have put up this Ilulissat Declaration.
Yes.
Even though that US is not party to the UNCLOS, but they are stating that this, the Arctic Ocean is going to be, which is an ocean, is frozen. It's going to be ruled by the UNCLOS,
United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
That's very, very important. I mean, there they state that they try to cope with this conflict, potential conflict. It is, because it's delimitation ahead,
right.
And it's also always a conflict.
But everyone has the same framework through the legal
At least
framework.
They have agreed upon, they have signed this Ilulissat Declaration, that that's what the intention is. And that's why it's so important to have done that. I mean, and that's promising, so to speak. But I also feel that you could also, that's my point, use this as an opportunity for international cooperation. I mean, we have seen areas where you try to make a deterrent or less tension by introducing research.
Yes.
And my vision and my hope is actually that we could look upon the Arctic Ocean as such an area for international cooperation regarding research. And so, just like, well, I come from the space community, like the International Space Station.
Yes.
That was actually a very remote area where you met US,
and
Russia,
cooperated
and
scientifically.
Made up a kind of research platform where you meet in the outer space in a very remote area. And you could compare that to the Arctic Ocean, a very remote area where you could meet and make science together and research together.
And the other comparison from our hemisphere, of course, would be the international scientific cooperation that inspired the Antarctic treaty system.
Yeah, and that could be interesting for Australia's also because, I mean, participate in research in the Arctic Ocean, because that should be open for everybody.
Yes.
Everyone can make contributions to that, especially also regarding the fact that, for example, a lot of experience from the Antarctic research could be used in the Arctic and vice versa. So a lot of countries, also from the southern hemisphere, could be a very good stakeholders in that research in the Arctic Ocean.
I think those are very fair points and encouraging points. At the same time, the Arctic and the Antarctic are, you were remarking earlier, are linked together in scientific terms. I wonder whether you could say a little bit more on that theme.
Yeah, well, you could look upon it in a practical way, and you could look at it in a more natural science way. A practical way is that at the polar DTU, which I'm heading, at DTU, we are very proud and find it very, very important to state that we have more than 100 years of experience in operating in the Arctic.
Yes. Yes.
And if you believe that you could go to such a remote, harsh area and do science without preparation or any kind of experience, you are lost. That goes for the same for those that has been for 100 years in the Antarctic.
Yes.
That's rule number one.
Reality.
You have to obey. Then comes the science. I mean, and a lot of the global change and the understanding of global change, then you must know or must understand the change at the polar regions together. I mean, you can't isolate, for example, the Arctic from the Antarctic in understanding how this global change is going on. So if you want to understand the change in the Arctic, you have to understand the change in the Antarctic. And then there are, of course, fundamentally regarding the interior of your Earth, and so, for example, the geomagnetic field, and so it's of course very related to both poles, and so that's obvious. The gravimetry, the potential fields theory, and all that, you have to look upon that on a global basis. That includes both poles, and so. So so you really, as a Arctic scientist, you also have to know about the Antarctic development and vice versa, I think.
Very good. Okay.
So, yeah.
One of the final points, I suppose, about the extended continental shelf issues, I think on a global basis we have of the order of 30 million square kilometers of extended continental shelf areas beyond 200 miles from baselines have been submitted to the CLCS.
Yeah, okay.
Around 3 million square kilometers of that 30 million are overlaps between different submissions in different states. So the Arctic is not exceptional in this, where we have the central part of the Arctic Ocean being subject to competing submissions and overlaps. And as I was saying, everyone appears to be playing by the rules in the sense that they are making their submissions. But there is certainly a subtext in domestic political terms of states making very clear statements related to the ownership of certain parts of the Arctic, and of course Santa's toy shop would be the primary focus. That certainly the North Pole having the Russian flag planted on the seabed underneath the North Pole, the Canadian Prime Minister essentially going on record and wanting to ensure that the North Pole was part of the Canadian submission to the CLCS. Yeah. So everyone is playing by the rules, but there are overlaps, and ultimately the Commission will come back with recommendations, and one fears that everyone cannot get everything they desire. So there is still going to be an acid test at some point whether everyone playing by the rules will survive the outcome from the Commission of a result that states don't like.
Right. And I mean, that's right. I mean, I fully agree. But,
we haven't had that test yet.
No, but I mean, what we would say delineation is one thing. I mean, that's really what the Commission at UN is dealing with. Say, it's okay. Do we really have this right to the extended continental shelf and outer limits and all that? But delimitation is, of course, another thing.
Yes.
And delimitation
between states.
Between states.
And
delimitation is a kind of course, playing by the rules, of course, but it's also about arguments, that's about policy, a lot
politics.
of it is, and I mean that's a part of it, and that's a very important part of it, and you should be aware of that from the very beginning when that argumentation starts.
That's right.
And that, as you said, can be driven from domestic interests actually.
Yes.
As you see it, and you can see, for example, also the fact that you could ask, has, for example, USA really realized that they are an Arctic nation? I mean, so there's a lot of issues there, but at the end, it's about compromises in a delimitation way.
That's right, it's a negotiation.
It's negotiation.
Unless one ends up going to court, which I doubt any Arctic state would desire doing so.
No, I couldn't imagine that, but that, I mean, you never know. And even if you go to the court, I mean, it would be nice to have all the arguments beforehand, not afterwards.
Go through the same process and frame your arguments, but for a slightly different audience, for an audience of judges rather than a negotiation between your adversarial states. But that issue you talked about earlier of having a fascinating opportunity to work in that space between science and policy making and legal issues. I think of it in the same way in terms of maritime or land boundary delimitation, the issue of the key disciplines that you need or interest areas. You need the technicians involved so that you can locate the line and then find it again. You need
that's reference systems.
That's right. You need the lawyers involved because you need to be able to come up with a binding instrument, a treaty, to agree, and you need to frame the agreement. But ultimately, at the top of that triangle is the politicians, because we're talking about the sovereignty and sovereign rights of states, and it's a negotiation where the politicians have the authority to sign the agreement or not. So we're dealing with that in that space between disciplines, which is fascinating. But I do agree we need to have the awareness that the politics can be the principal issue that we have to deal with, and the authority.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the issues also regarding what makes the polar region or the Arctic region a bit special in this context compared to other ECS claims around the world is that when we are talking about delimitation, and perhaps we have got an agreement between countries, you have to be present. You have to be sure that you can look after this area. There are obligations to that, search and rescue and everything. And that's, of course, a challenge in the Arctic.
It's a huge and increasing challenge. If we're seeing, and we are generally seeing, as a consequence of the melting, increasing navigation, increasing activity, increasing development, that's more opportunities, unfortunately, for accidents and for mishaps, which inevitably occur, which then demands search and rescue, and having all of the infrastructure in place to deal with that increasing activity, which is a burden upon the Arctic states.
It is.
Certainly.
Yeah. So together with opportunities, always is obligations.
Absolutely.
So that goes especially also for the Arctic Ocean, and that's a harsh environment to meet those obligations up there.
Very
in
much
a general sense.
Very challenging.
Yeah.
It struck me for the northern sea route across the northern coast of Siberia. Much of the traffic is commercial in nature. Through the Northwest Passage across the north of North America, Canada and Alaska, an awful lot of the traffic, the proportion of the traffic is small boats and yachts and motor vessels of a private nature. And one can imagine an increasingly adventure cruising activities occurring, where you are putting a substantial number of civilians and tourists in that harsh environment. And of course, we love to go to this environment because, as you say, it's fascinating and fantastic nature to witness there. But inevitably, there is also potentially risk there, because if I can observe, if I can't afford to go on a cruise ship. I think you need to be at a senior level in your life to be able to go on this kind of expensive cruise, particularly the adventure cruising is at the higher end, which means that the complement of passengers on board the ship that might hit the iceberg and be in dire trouble are not the sort of passengers that you want to leave exposed in a lifeboat for any length of time. And yet the search and rescue capacity and high latitudes is inevitably limited.
Yeah, and I mean, now we are here I am in Australia, close to New Zealand, and you are very famous and very good at extreme sports. That's what I like very much. You're outdoor people, so that's fantastic. But you could, well, people, ordinary people, even perhaps wealthy people, are looking for extreme experiences.
Yes,
that's why they're now looking for space tourism. Because
yes,
that's going to be an industry. In the same way, you want to have an extreme experience in going on a cruise. Okay, it's fantastic to Caribbean, but everybody has been, not everybody, but a lot of people have been there. I'm not actually, but Arctic tourism is still a kind of extreme. You feel that you are, or the Antarctic, of course, or the polar areas. You still have that feeling of being out in the wilderness and all that.
Yes.
So that will put a big pressure also on the polar regions. That is simply tourism.
That's right.
Extreme experiences for people. So
and with that extreme experience comes risk.
Yeah. And well, they are now trying to regulate that in the Arctic because, you know, with two ships sailing, but you still have one ship has to be below the horizon, otherwise the tourists don't feel that they are out in the wilderness all alone if they can see another ship around the iceberg.
Yes.
So, and you know, if you have to have a cruise ship below the horizon in the Arctic and something happens and you go into the lifeboats,
they're out of reach.
after a few minutes you're frozen to death. So I mean, so it's not easy.
Yes, yeah, there are challenges. Certainly challenges. One question on this: there is a global fascination with the Arctic, as we can see because we're talking about it in Australia, but there are some of the issues around the Ilulissat Declaration of the Arctic Five, the 5 coastal states of the Arctic. They were framing their discussions of the Arctic in the Law of the Sea Convention, and I take the point that that is a very positive move to make, that everyone is subscribing to the framework of the Law of the Sea Convention.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were in a sense saying, well, we're dealing with it.
Exactly.
The Arctic 5 are dealing with this issue. We are the coastal states around it. Is there a role for extra-regional states, for states from outside the Arctic? There have been certainly movements and statements from within Europe, the European Parliament, that it should be a role for the European Union, which of course Denmark is part of, to have a voice within the Arctic.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're right. I can only think it because I don't know it, but I could imagine that the Ilulissat Declaration, of course, was to prepare the nations regarding the extended continental shelf claims in the Arctic and so, and keep that stable and try to regulate that in a good way and so. But the other part was also that the Arctic 5 nations said, okay, we are setting the scene here.
Yes.
We don't want everybody else to come here and tell us what we have to do here, because we are the coastal states around this Arctic Ocean.
It's our responsibility.
It's our responsibility, but we also want to be those who decide what to do in this context. Not in too much involvement. I only fancy this, but involvement from UN, EU, or whatever. So we take on this responsibility, so to speak, as sovereign states to rule this area and try to make it still a non-conflict area. If you let it loose, nothing happens, well, then conflicts may arise. So it's also try to stabilize it. Then do you then exclude everybody else from the Arctic? No, actually we have the Arctic Council. And that has been made up in, I think it was 98, as a kind of a forum. It's not an organization, it's not a union or whatever, it's a forum where you could meet. That is the Arctic Council coordinations around,
but not legally binding.
The Nordic, exactly.
Outputs.
And also there are 4 indigenous organizations represented there. And then you have a lot of observers.
Yes.
You can apply for being an observer.
Australia, I don't think Australia is.
No, but why not?
Yet,
why not?
Yes.
EU has tried.
Yes.
They want to go in as a union, and I mean, I know from the official political statement is that the Kingdom of Denmark would like that EU was an observer, but Canada wouldn't like it because, you know, some restrictions regarding trade with furs and everything. So that was more politics. So it is.
But I know we have others such as China, Singapore.
Yeah, China, Singapore are observers now.
Yes.
Yeah, and so why not? But I think that's an important forum where you can come up with ideas, where you can meet in an, you wouldn't say informal way, but where you can raise your voice and come up with arguments. So I look upon the Arctic Council as a very important forum for kind of having, it's a kind of a buffer for not having, where you can try to meet perhaps big challenges there, raise it before it becomes an area of conflict. So, and the Arctic Council is actually preparing treaties or agreements that can be legal binding for the nations around, but it's of course not in the context of the Arctic Council, but for the individual nations. That goes, for example, for the search and rescue. That could go for environment in general and for fishing as well. So I think the Arctic Council is a way to approaching the Arctic in a good way.
In a cooperative sense.
In a cooperative sense.
Probably that on that guardedly cooperative note, because the Arctic Council provides an opportunity for connection, for dialogue, and therefore for building cooperation into the future. I'd like to thank you, Niels, for the opportunity for this conversation, and thank you ever so much for coming down to the University of Wollongong to provide us with that discussion, which has been fantastic. Thank you.
This has been a pleasure, Clive, and it's me thanking for having the opportunity to have this talk here and also to visit you here in Anchors. It's been a real big pleasure. Yeah, thank you.